Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar in the Envisage Public Safety Innovation Series. My name is Ari Vidali. I am founder and CEO of Envisage Technologies and your host today. As a leading provider of training and readiness software for first responders, we're deeply passionate about spreading best practices and new ideas that make America safer. Today we're going to discuss school safety in the 21st century and some best practices for active shooter events. Now, as a father of three beautiful children, I can tell you our topic today is deeply personal for me, and I think for many of you. We have an incredible response to this webcast with hundreds of sign-ups and many of you that signed up participating today. And I think this is indicative because we all realize that children are the most vulnerable population in America, and our schools are really soft targets for deranged and cold-blooded killers like Adam Lanza, who, as many of you know, on December 14, 2012, murdered 26 people, 20 of which were small children in Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. The Department of Homeland Security is well aware of the underlying vulnerability of our nation's schools, which provide a soft target for terrorists to attack the very fabric of our society. Imagine the panic and terror that just a few active killers can create by targeting our children. That's really a sad truth, that as a nation we usually only make changes or invest in best practices after people have died. And it is clear that most schools in America are woefully unprepared to deal with an active killer incident or a coordinated terrorist attack against their most vulnerable population. I personally believe not enough is being done to secure these soft targets. So today we will discuss emerging best practices and what can be done to create safer environments for our kids at school. This webinar is going to last about 45 minutes, and we will take questions at the end. To provide us with questions, you can actually type them. There is a box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen where at any time during the webcast you can type in your questions, and then we will be selecting some of those questions for the speaker at the end of the session. The session will also be recorded, and a link to the recording will be provided to all of you who registered. So please share this information with anyone who might benefit from it. Now it's my honor to welcome our presenter today, M.B.Wooldridge. Mason is the founder and president of M.B.Wooldridge Associates, which is an Indianapolis-based consulting firm specializing in the protection of America's educational environments. Mr. Wooldridge consults with law enforcement organizations, educational organizations, legislators, not-for-profits, and the like in order to advance a safe school movement within Indiana designed to create school safety standards adopted on the state level. Mr. Wooldridge is a school safety specialist and direct consultant for the Indiana Sheriff's Association to aid in their efforts towards protecting every school within Indiana equally. His company's mission is simple: better protect America's educational environments, to better prepare educational teachers and staff for dealing with escalating levels of violence in their schools, and to create more accountable and exceptional youth throughout America and its learning environments. M.B.Wooldridge Associates is a boutique consulting firm specializing in school safety, risk mitigation, and student development. They're located in Indianapolis, Indiana. Now, without much further ado, I would like to turn this over to Mason to discuss emerging best practices for school safety. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thank you for the introduction. We're here today really for the purpose to talk about what best practices are. We're here to shed some light on some statistical data that may not be presented properly in the media, so you there listening, you there watching, will be able to have a better understanding of how serious these life-threat emergencies really are. We're really here to give you a general overview of what's being done, as Ari so eloquently put, in emerging best practices, so that you have a better understanding moving forward of how you can better protect your loved ones and how you can move forward to have safer communities. So first, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start breaking down the trends that are happening across America when talking about these active shooter, active killer events. We see over the last 15 years or so that there's a growing trend of violent crimes happening in our schools. If we look at our top graphic there talking about the time between Columbine and Sandy Hook, we see that there's a large amount of wounded, a large amount of dead, and these numbers do not get presented to us in the media. We as parents, we as law enforcement personnel, we as educators, we're not really aware of how serious of an issue these active killer, active shooter threats are, because really the main things they get talked about are the massive massacre events in the media. So what we want to be able to do is here start talking about some of these trends. We see that between time of Columbine and Sandy Hook, we obviously see those large numbers, but what I want to really break down is showing you here on our bottom left, we see 75 school shootings resulting in 38 deaths happening between 2013 to 2015. So in those 2 years, 13 and 14, we see the rate of violence rising exponentially from the previous 13 years. Now, when we look down to the right, we also see 50 school shootings and 70 school deaths happening in 2015, not taking into account the most recent month or so of the school year this year. So moving on, I'd like to get into really what's being done in schools currently is nothing more than peace of mind tactics so that parents feel good about sending their kids to school on the bus. What's being done nationwide are the best things that we think are out there, whether that's coming from our men and women who serve as law enforcement, whether that's coming from the men and women who are administrators in school districts and in schools in particular, whether that be our teachers or our students. But what today's real point is to be able to tell you, no, there's a lot more being done than what's being expressed currently, either through different school assessment groups, whether it be through different training organizations. What we want you to lead today is understanding the threat, knowing what you can do about it, and then knowing that there's a lot more happening throughout the U.S. that you can bring back into your school districts to talk about. So there's a big differentiation we need to make before we get started, and that's the difference between an active shooter, active killer event and a planned killing. Now, in an active shooter or an active killer event, there are no real specified targets individually. There is a group target mindset that happens, and is normally carried out by someone that is far beyond help, far beyond understanding. And they're done in areas like schools, like movie theaters, hospitals, confined spaces where people are isolated into their area, and those are what are known as soft targets. So we see in this graphic, we see that an active killer, an active shooter, makes his attack on these targets because it's hard for these people to get away. And the harder it is, the more vulnerable someone is within a target, is what dictates that target is a soft target. So moving forward, if we use the term soft target, it's referring to any space where victims can be confined collectively. So an active killer has the ability to create mass casualties and mass chaos in a very quick amount of time. Now, when we think about a planned killing, we think about someone coming in with a feud with someone. These are things that tactics are very ineffective in dealing with because they are planned to the degree where it's a certain target, it's an individual that's carrying out this attack based normally on a feud, an altercation, a disagreement. Anything that fuels these events fuels a singular mindset of I'm going to get a person. What we're dealing with and what we're talking about and the message we're spreading today is that these active killer, active shooter incidents are on the rise, and there's a lot that can be done about it. To really understand what can be done to start mitigating these events more effectively, we need to see and talk about at first what the vulnerabilities are to law enforcement in even arriving to an event. Now, in later slides, we're going to break down each of these individually, but as a quick overview, law enforcement have 5 limiting factors when responding to an incident. We see the lack of immediate notification, so that means someone doesn't know that the event's happening. We see, number 2, the lack of ability to protect the victims within their physical or isolated spaces. 3, lack of ability to locate, identify, and track a suspect in a building. 4, law enforcement do not have the ability to know the status of each classroom. 5, law enforcement lack the ability to do anything en route to stop the active killer. And we're going to be saying these and going over these quite a few times because I want everybody involved here to understand that the reality of the situation in educational environments today is not like it is in a movie theater. The reality of law enforcement's response to an incident is not like you see in movies. The good guys, the sheepdogs, the law enforcement men and women of America who protect our communities do their absolute very best with the tools they have and will arrive at the scene as quickly as possible. But what I want everybody to understand is there's factors that even they face that we need to start talking about as a populace. So moving on, we'll go into the first factor to be able to mitigate an active shooter, active killer event for law enforcement, and that's lack of immediate notification. We'll get into some statistics here shortly, but just generally and just briefly, the first thing law enforcement need to know is that a situation is taking place, that an incident is happening. Currently, right now, we are falling very short of responding effectively to law enforcement with information that an incident is taking place. So moving on from the lack of immediate notification, we see that the second piece of information that law enforcement needs is they need to be able to protect victims in space. And what I mean is law enforcement have to drive to the school. SROs have to run through the school. And for anybody that's listening, an SRO is just shorthand for School Resource Officer. We'll say SRO a few more times throughout this, so I just want to have that up front. If law enforcement can't tell a school how to protect the people inside the school, then when an event happens, then that shooter, that killer, that suspect, that attacker can move from room to room to room, and that's what causes these massacres, is that ability to get to victims. So law enforcement lack immediate notification. The schools with law enforcement lack the ability to protect the victims in spaces. 3, we see there's a lack of ability to be able to locate, identify, and track a threat. And some people listening today will say, duh, of course there is, because we don't have that information. But what we'll find later on is that that information is available. So for some listening, I know you're going, how is this possible? Tell me right now what we need to do to figure this out. We'll get to it, I promise. But for the sake of this piece right now, we just want you to know that currently law enforcement do not have information about the shooter, the killer, the weapons platforms, where the shooter's been, where the shooter's going, and what the shooter or killer is actively doing. So moving from 3 into 4, we also see that there's no information coming out of the classrooms that can be deciphered as actionable intelligence for law enforcement while en route. We don't know in a classroom, are they safe, are they wounded, are they under attack, is the shooter currently in the classroom? So we see 1, lack of immediate notification, 2, lack of ability to protect victims, 3, lack of ability to locate, identify. Moving into 4, the status of the classrooms, the trend is starting to develop, which is there is no real intelligence coming out of a building. 5, we move into more of a hands-on opportunity for law enforcement, and that is currently there's nothing to do while en route to move that shooter, to stop that shooting, or to be able to move a suspect or people inside of a building where you want. And where we'll get to towards the end is describing what's being done about that is out there in the market today that schools are using that actually give law enforcement the opportunity to use the building to fight back while en route. Next, I want to give a little bit more information moving forward so we can build off of this as to what an actual timeline looks like in one of these events. Now, you'll find varying and differing ideas, whether it's 1 or 2 minutes different than what you see today. You'll see that in 2015, 2014, 2013, those 3 years combined have a much more rapid event timeline than from 1999 to 2013. So depending on what you read, where you read it, always check the facts and see what years these numbers are coming from. But for the point of today, we're talking about the most recent 3 years, 4 years of these events happening. So if we see the first bit of information that should be startling for anybody on here is that once a shot has been fired, once an incident has started, there's a 2 to 4 minute lag time before that call goes out of a building. Okay, and as we move through seeing these other points, you'll see why this is so important. But to understand that 2 to 4 minutes, the event is happening. And that's why these incidents turn into massacres, because the shooter can gain entrance into these soft targets. They know calls aren't going out for a certain time. And that 2 to 4 minutes is victim-initiated calling, meaning someone that's being shot at, someone that thinks they hear shots, or someone who's just afraid that someone creepy is walking by and making the call. That's happening well behind those first shots or that first killing start. And that doesn't matter if you have an SRO in the building. That doesn't matter if you have a law enforcement agency across the street or 20 miles away. These are our national averages for that call going out. The next piece of information that we see is that nationally, law enforcement have a drive time of 7 to 15 minutes to a scene. Now, in a metro area compared to a rural area, is that going to be faster? Yes, definitely. Maybe 1 minute, maybe 5 minutes, maybe somewhere in between there. But if that call is coming out at 2 to 4, and even if you have a super fast response of 7 minutes or 5 minutes, you're still seeing a huge lag time behind. But keep those numbers in your mind as we move into the next one, because 2 to 4 minutes plus 7 to 15 minutes, think of the best and worst timing possible there for the next statistic. What we see is that on average, someone is being shot or wounded in an active killer event every 3 to 9 seconds. So that draws back into my mind, and it should to everyone listening, that if that call is going out 2 to 4 minutes after that first wounded, that first casualty, that first shot fired, that first stabbing, that first pipe bomb, and 3 to 9 seconds, somewhere in there someone's being hurt, we're seeing that 2 to 4 minutes is absolutely way behind the reactionary curve to give police an opportunity to mitigate these situations. And then if we take into account the 7 to 15 minutes of a drive time, we see that even though law enforcement are going to be driving 120 miles per hour and trying to get there as fast as humanly possible and get there to end the incident is happening, and what the next statistic will show is that the incident is not only happening but over before they even arrive. And you might ask yourself, how is this possible? Well, the majority of these incidents end in the killer taking their own life, whether on purpose or by accident. We see also the good bystander rule, where people will show up and intercede before police get there, or in many cases the shooter fleeing or the killer fleeing the scene as an evacuation process is taking place. So this screen should stick out in your mind as unacceptable for how we're providing law enforcement information and for how we're dealing with these horrendous crimes known as active killer and active shooter events. Now that we know a little bit more, we know more of a timeline, we know what law enforcement are lacking to be able to respond more effectively, it's very important before moving forward for you to understand that your communities deserve better. Your communities deserve this information. Your law enforcement officers deserve to know what's happening in a school if there's an emergency, not just because of their position in the society and in the community, but because their kids might be at your school. Their family might be teaching at your school. Their family might be the administrators at your school. Communities are held together by those who protect the community and those who build into the community. And you need to know that you deserve the right to be better protected. And we're going to show you how that happens moving here on out. So if we move into the next slide, we're going to build a little bit more information for you, only to the degree that it's important to understand a little bit better about what information different groups need and how much collectively, holistically, community-wise, these groups need this information. So in the first half of the puzzle, we see 3 groups represented. We see our educators, we see our students, then we see administration staff. We're going to use this top half of the puzzle to deal with those inside of the school during an incident. First, our educators. Educators need to know what their role are during an incident. They need to know where to be. They need to know where to tell students to go. They need to know how to herd people effectively. They need to know what is the best means in one of these incidents for me to help the law enforcement groups arriving mitigate the actual incident. So educators need the overarching ideas and information to tell the students, which are our second group, what their role is currently as well. So in an incident right now, and we'll get into this a little bit later, which is nationally how students are being told what to do and educators are being told what to do and so on and so forth. But what students need to know in an incident is just as important as educators, because they need to know, if something's happening, where do I go? If something's happening, who do I tell? If something's happening, do I make a call? What happens if my teacher gets shot? What happens if a shooter gets into my classroom? So inside of a building, we see the educators need information to protect the students. The students need information to work with the educators, but also to help protect the students. And both groups, educators and students, the information they need moves into working with the admin and staff. Because in any school situation, environment, you have your administrators and your staff who are overseeing the workings on a day-to-day basis, but specifically in one of these instances, they need to go into pure crisis mode, but not in a chaotic state. So admin and staff needs to know where the shooter is. Admin and staff need to know where are our students. Admin and staff need to know what do we do in these situations and where do we send our people to shepherd what rooms. Admin and staff needs to know the situation is happening, just like dispatch, just like our first responders, just like the educators and students, because they need to get to their safe areas as well. So we see from inside the school, the first half of the puzzle, the first three pieces are coming from the school, all need more information than they're getting today. Moving into the second piece, we see where more of the community on the outside comes into play. Now, we have the hospital, law enforcement, and EMS. What's important for hospitals to know, the main thing a hospital needs to know and understand is what is the event and what is the severity of the event, meaning what kind of triage do we need to have ready at the hospital in our emergency room for when people start coming in from these events with serious wounds, serious injuries, so that we can save as many people as possible. Next, we see the law enforcement group, which are part of the whole puzzle, but are also the most essential in this puzzle. And we started going through those 5 factors, and the information that law enforcement need, they need to know it started, just like admin and staff, just like students and teachers. They need to know where the bad guy is. They need to know what weapons platforms that bad guy has. They need to know where are our kids, what's happening inside of the building. Because when they arrive to the scene, they need to know where to make entrance. There are schools across America that range from 75 kids and smaller to 5,000 children and larger. Now, when you think about a school that's 75 kids, that's a small elementary school, you can run around the building in about 2 or 3 minutes, meaning there might be 2 hallways, 3 hallways, 1 hallway, and you can get to where you need to go. But when you arrive to a school that's 5,000 students or even 1,000 students, the campuses are massive. And you can arrive and be completely on the wrong part of the campus because you don't know where the shooting is taking place. So law enforcement need this information to kind of tie all of these groups in together. Lastly, but very important piece is EMS. That group of first responders need to be able to get into a building and know where the wounded are. Now, currently, in most communities, your EMS first responders will not enter a building until it has been cleared by law enforcement. And when I mean cleared, I mean room to room, closet to closet. Law enforcement has gone in and come out and given the official all clear sign. And it's not because of lack of heroism. It's because if a first responder goes in to save someone's life, EMS person goes in to save someone's life, they don't want to cause more harm than has already been caused. They need to get in and triage and save lives as quickly as possible. So we see the hospital needs to know how to be prepared. Law enforcement needs to know how to arrive and what kind of fight they're in for. EMS needs to come into the instance knowing where do we get to the wounded to get them out and taken care of as quickly as possible. Next, we see the whole puzzle together really gives you a good indication that this is a community initiative to protect our schools better. And we see that the information piece runs congruent throughout the entire puzzle. And we see without the information, it's not even a completed puzzle. So all of these groups need their own bits of information, but all of the groups share in needing to know that an incident's taking place and the severity of the incident. There's a few other groups that don't get talked about as much because we haven't seen quite the need yet. But as Ari was talking about in the beginning, there's concerns coming out of the National Department of Homeland Security and our statewide Departments of Homeland Security that there are domestic and foreign terrorists that are desiring and wanting and putting into plans right now as we speak to go after our school system, to go after our educational environments, and not in a small, chaotic way, in a large-scale calculated attack to try and shut down our education system. This is a real-life concern that people within state level and national level Homeland Security are dealing with on a daily basis for how to train for this, how to pass information. So before we get into any more about them, I want to talk parents and community. We see that they're part of this puzzle and part of the overarching hand that's holding this puzzle together, because in an emergency, dispatchers cannot be flooded with hundreds or thousands of calls coming from parents in the community as to what's happening in the incident. Where do I go to pick up my kids? What's going on? Have you found people? Because what that does, that will backlog a dispatch system and actually shut it down to where it doesn't properly function correctly if enough calls come in. So what we need to see is that not only does the people within the school need more information, not only do the groups responding need more information, but those inside the community, the parents of the children that are being affected, they need to know what their role is in this situation as well, which we'll tag a little bit more at the end when we start talking about safety plans and other ideas. We see National DHS for a few more comments on the slide, and we'll move on. If there is a calculated attack that happens around America or in the Midwest or in isolated pockets of America, they need to have that information immediately to them so that they can disseminate that rapidly throughout America so that schools can move into their evacuation protocols and they can move to their staging areas, or they can move to a complete lockdown of America's schools. Now, not so much different than the state level Department of Homeland Security, because it's not just like we talked about not knowing when or where an active killer event was going to take place. We don't know when or where within a state when this attack happens it's what's going to happen. But if it is a state attack where there are multiple terrorist groups that are coming after our schools, coming after our children, it will take Indiana, for example. There's 2,024 public K through 12 schools in Indiana, and if we have 4 schools, 5 schools, 3 schools, 2 schools, 10 attacked at the same time, that still leaves 2,000 plus schools that need to go into evacuation mode. Not only the evacuation mode, but resources need to move very fast from the state level DHS into these areas to start working with the local hospitals, to start working with the rural communities and the metro areas to make these situations move into a better outcome than they would be if the information wasn't there. Moving on, what is America doing in response to these active killer, active shooter threats? Well, if we look at the beginning and we see the 5 mitigating factors for law enforcement to respond to an event, I think it's fairly safe to say we're not doing enough. Now, on a national level, we're seeing that different states are using different best practices to define their safety code, for a better lack of a term. We see that doors are being barred. Doors are having certain locks put on them. We're seeing glass is being better protected. We're seeing access control going on to schools, into their entrances and exits. We're seeing more camera systems. We're seeing all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of school safety assessment experts coming into school districts and telling them how to spend their money. But what we're not seeing is information, ideas, best practices unified and sent to law enforcement in an easy-to-use package, meaning we are protecting the doors. We are protecting the entrances. We are giving immediate notification. We are giving law enforcement the ability to locate and track a shooter. We are giving law enforcement something to do en route. So taken as a whole nationally, we are literally using piecemeal Band-Aid approaches to a larger, what I'm going to refer to as an epidemic in our country because of the rate of violence that it's happening and the amount wounded and killed. So nationally, what we're seeing is a piecemeal approach to a whole pie problem. So if we move into the next slide, what needs to happen, and I'm going to go through it again because you have to get into your minds that not only are these important for law enforcement to have, not only are these factors that law enforcement face important for them, but it's important for you as a community to understand your schools, your educators, your kids, and your law enforcement professionals deserve these pieces of information. And the only way to mitigate an active killer incident that efficiently is to combine all of these pieces into a package and get that intelligence to law enforcement. So if we look at a unified, holistic approach to school safety, we know the 5 factors for law enforcement. We need to answer those, and we need to answer them together. So we see those located within the tray. But what we see are 2 other pieces that we haven't talked about and only alluded to. And that's what I'd like to start with, which is the safety plan. Your safety plans inside of your schools are completely different from school district to school district. And what I mean is protocols for how to deal with an active killer event, an active shooter event. They're even different from schools to schools within their own district. So what we see is a safety plan is really the first step that a school district can take or a school system can take to make their schools safer. The current state of school safety plans in most places, if you were to read them as a parent and take a few minutes or take the information you learned today and then go read your school safety plan at your school, if you can even find it, if they even have it available for you to read on their website or by request, you will be outraged because of the lack of functional use that's inside of these safety plans. Now, a point to be made here is many school districts feel alone in this and like they can't involve law enforcement to help. Please, dear God, please, if you're in a school district, if you're an administrator, please reach out to your local law enforcement. Have them involved. Have them walking through the school to help you draft these plans. Not only will it better affect an outcome if one of these situations were to happen, but it gets law enforcement involved in the discussion. It gets law enforcement involved in building plans so when they arrive to the scene, they know what you're doing. The next piece we see is the training. Just like in sports, the old adage, you play like you practice, it is important that schools start training for an active killer, active shooter event. And I don't mean you have to broadcast over the loudspeaker we're being attacked or to try and make it as real as possible, and that because it could scare children. My point is the same way you have a fire drill, the same frequency, have an active shooter drill. Have the law enforcement there to walk your teachers through these situations so that if they happen, the whole school knows what their responsibility is. And as a parent, have your whole district have the same school safety plan so that your kids are building because of redundancy. When they're starting in elementary school, they move to middle school, they move to high school. It's the same style plan. So you're not having to reteach, you're only having to refresh. It saves a lot of money, it saves a lot of time. So we've gone through kind of giving you an overview. What is the situation? What are the trends? We've answered the question, are these school shootings growing? Yeah, they're growing. Are these school killings growing? Yeah. This is becoming a real problem, not just in America, but worldwide. What I want to be able to tell you now is we want to move into, since we understand what the vulnerabilities are, we understand what needs to happen inside the community, what intelligence needs to pass. I want to share with you what's happening in Indiana, because any school district around America, any law enforcement agency around America, they can use Indiana as a template for success. Now, what's happening here is Indiana Sheriff's Association was the first group of law enforcement in America to stand up and say there's better ways to protect our school districts, and we are going to highlight those and put them into a school, what they call a safe school flagship school. So parents, administrators, legislators, law enforcement groups, educational groups can all come together to see this. And what they did is they took all of this information that law enforcement needed, the immediate notification, the ability to protect victims in space, the ability to locate, track, and identify a threat, the ability to know the status of each classroom, and then the ability to do something while en route. And they put it all into a package. And they worked with companies to develop packages so that the counties of Indiana can start moving towards unified protection. They can start moving towards new standards of safety. So we see the 5 pieces that are been changed to actually give actionable intelligence to law enforcement. What we want to go to next is how they've changed the standards of doors in Indiana going into schools. Now, when I say change the standards, this isn't something where the state of Indiana is going to be forced or mandated overnight to move to these standards. What's happening is legislation is being drafted and being discussed right now about all new schools being built will have to have these standards of safety in them. They'll have to have a certain kind of ballistic glass on exterior windows or laminate. They'll have to have the ability to give immediate notification. They'll have to have all the things we've talked about. One of the things I just wanted to share with you quickly was the vulnerabilities in the door, so you can see the difference between what's happening in Indiana and the hardened door system and the rest of America. So if you look at this door right now, and we'll take portion A, okay, the locks, knobs, and latches. You can get into a classroom, a typical classroom door, in less than 10 seconds with nothing more than a hammer. Now, in most active shooter, active killer events, the shooter will go and play with the handle, the doorknob, and if it's locked, they move on. But what will happen is, if they move to a certain amount of classrooms and they can't get in, they're just going to start shooting through, or they're going to bust their way through. And what alarmed me was when I was doing door testing to work with Indiana, a standard school door, me, myself, with a little hammer could be in 10 seconds to get inside the classroom. So we see the locks, specifically the latch area around the lock is vulnerable. Even with a great mortise lock, 1 9mm round to the latch opens the door right up. We see the vision window. Now, on this door, they had a lot bigger vision windows than what are current standards today in most new construction. But even new construction standards of vision windows still don't use a ballistic-rated glass or a laminate to stop from being able to be broken in. So that's very easily penetrated. We see, if we move to C, we see the hinges with a more high-powered shotgun or a higher-powered weapon. A few rounds of buckshot, not even that, take a hinge out and can pull the door down. And we also see this particular door has a vent system, which is very standard for schools built between 1950 and 1970. You still see these in thousands of doors across America. We won't even look at the vent. We'll pretend that's not there. Just the door itself, even a solid core door is vulnerable to being able to put a few rounds shotgun shells through, or higher caliber like a .308 or a 44, something like that, to be able to gain entrance into the classroom. So as we see as a whole, that door is very vulnerable to attack. Now, if we move into what new standards are, it's, listen, you got to use a mortise lock. So if it's an architect listening right now, here's kind of what's happening. You have to use a mortise lock. Not only do you have to use a mortise lock, but you have to put some lock protection around it, meaning the latch piece of the lock has to be protected from bullets. Vision window. Currently, ballistic grade 3 glass is regarded as pretty much the highest rating that you can put into an educational environment or in general rating-wise. What's happening in Indiana is there is something now ballistic 3 plus, okay? And what that means is not only will rounds not go through that glass, but you cannot take your weapon and beat the glass out. And it has to last up to a certain amount of minutes with a certain amount of beating, with a certain amount of pressure, up to 308, not being able to penetrate that glass. The door itself, not only is a standard core door, a solid core door, but what it has to have something ballistically rated lining this door as well, so that a pipe bomb can't get through, so that bullets aren't able to make entrance into the classroom. And lastly, we see a hinge system. We're going to get rid of the 3 hinges and we're going to put a continuous hinge. It makes it easier to not only hang the door functionally, but what it does is it protects your entire hinge. And the last piece to understand, so if this is a school administrator, this is someone who's part of UL listening to this, if this is someone part of fire department or fire code enforcement, the doors still operate the exact same way. The functionality of a door remains the same. You really look at this door, you don't really see anything that much different between this and a normal door in any school, but it's what's referred to now as a hardened door system. So if we move on, we're going to jump to the last piece right here, and that is what law enforcement can do en route to push the shooter, to move the killer, to block areas. What's been introduced in Indiana are what are known as countermeasures or hot zones. Okay, and a countermeasure is anything that law enforcement can use through dispatch to be able to fire in a school to either help put out a fire or to block or impede a shooter's movement. In no way are the different countermeasures being used throughout Indiana effective negatively for the students inside the building, but what they do for law enforcement is they give them the opportunity to protect every classroom equally, obscure all hallways totally if they choose, but it gives them another tool. So while en route, while driving 120 miles per hour to that school, if they have a 7 or 15-minute drive time, that shooter is not shooting. That shooter can't even see the hand in front of their face, but law enforcement are still able to track and locate that shooter, even through the different smoke. And if a shooter decides to use arson, which has been part of many plans recently and which will be part of plans in the future, the different countermeasures can be used to put that fire out once it's been started. We've really been able to break down a lot of information for you today. I've fired it at you rapidly. There's a lot to take in because a lot of what you heard today you may not have known, or you may think I'm crazy. But as you let this settle into your psyche, and as you think about what a timeline looks like in an active killer event, when you think about the abilities that law enforcement need that they don't currently have to effectively mitigate an incident, when you think about your community and how vulnerable it really is, knowing how many of these attacks are increasing in nature and in rate over the last several years, that it can no longer be that mindset, this won't happen here, this can't happen here. The mindset has to change too, and I hate that this is the state of our country right now, but it is, plain and simple. This will happen, and how do we prepare for it? And then if it doesn't, great, but the mindset has to change too. This will happen, and how are we going to prepare? School administrators, the liability factor for you folks is going to grow exponentially over the next decade because the private market is coming up with unbelievable, cost-effective ways to make these changes happen in schools. The public market, meaning law enforcement groups, as this information gets out more and more and more, will demand this not only for the protection of them coming to the school, but primarily so they can protect you better. The sheepdogs of this world are doing their job because they want to protect you. So as information passes, as you let this webinar marinate in your psyche, I think you'll come to the same conclusions that I've come to as a school safety specialist, and that's we need a unified, holistic approach to solving this problem. Okay, and there's a lot more information that goes behind this, where if you're listening and you're saying, how do we do this in my community tomorrow, you can go to ourkidsdeserveit.org, which is a nonprofit that I've started in Indiana to help spread these messages, spread this understanding, spread this awareness, to be able to get to schools and help them understand what's happening and what better can happen. Now, through this website, you'll be able to find more information and ask for it. You'll be able to understand what's happening with the school safety bill. You'll get a full timeline of what's going on, how this started in Indiana, who the key players are, and you'll also get a better understanding of how you as a parent, or you as an administrator, or you as a law enforcement person, or you as just a grandparent or somebody in the community can start making this change happen literally right away. Now, there's a few more points before we get into the question side. How do we go immediately from this discussion and make this happen? Well, first step was go to ourkidsdeserveit.org, request information, get on the mailing list. The site will continually update. It will continually feed you what's happening so you can do it in your community. But spread the message. And take what you heard today, take the information you get from Our Kids Deserve It, and take it to your local law enforcement groups. Take it to your school administrators. Take it to your principals. And don't take it feeling angry at someone for not doing something. Take it to them to share, hey, we can do something better, so let's figure out here. Next, go right to your local representatives. Take whatever you get and email it to them. Email them this webinar link. Email them the white paper that you can get from this, and hold them accountable, and occasionally call and email and ask, what are you doing to better protect our communities? And lastly, we are approaching a presidential election, which means we are approaching an opportunity for many more to be elected as well, whether it be our Senate or our representatives. So use this to talk to your national reps, to your senators, and say, this is a situation that we have that I want you talking about nationally. So really, it's spreading the message, it's getting the information, it's reaching back out and promoting this webinar to your local environments throughout your entire community. Share it with friends, family, teachers, students, your church, your community organizations. It doesn't matter. Just get the message out, and then make sure your law enforcement groups know about this, because just as you deserve your kids to be safe, they deserve the right to better protect their communities. So, all right, with that, I think we got a lot covered.
Thank you, Mason. You know, what's amazing, if you didn't think this was important, during this webinar, while Mason was talking, there was an active killer event on a community college in Oregon. 10 people killed, more than 20 injured at the Umpqua Community College in Oregon.
Jeez.
So while you were talking, that casualty count just racked up another 10, or 30, actually, 10 dead and 20 injured are the preliminary reports. So a couple of questions that we got from our audience while you were speaking. First question is, do you have any suggestions for safety officers protecting state colleges where fire and evacuation drills are not practiced? How can I educate the college to show them how imperative it is to train for these events?
I'd say the first thing you can do is your fire code within your state or within the country as a whole dictates fire drills to be done. They dictate safety plans to be created. So my first instinct is to call your state fire marshal's office and ask them, can you send someone down to back me up in going to our administrators to talk about planning these drills? If that doesn't get the traction that you need, then go directly to the state fire marshal and say, I need your backing on this to come down. Because I can tell you, the school administrators are wonderfully amazing people, okay? Their lives are so busy that sometimes it takes that extra oomph of liability to help them understand, no, this is a situation we really need to deal with. So first, go call the fire marshal's office, see if you can get someone to back you up. If that doesn't work, go directly to the state fire marshal and have them come down to your school, because they'll be more than glad to help in that transition process.
What are your thoughts about schools arming teams of teachers? The teams would need to be voluntary, screened, and trained by law enforcement and trained, drilled regularly.
Okay, so I am neither for nor against that. I will promote that, and if there's a school district that wants to talk about how to make that effective in their school district, then there are definitely great ways in pursuing that. Now, I can tell you a couple of the drawbacks that I've heard from law enforcement that I didn't think about when I first got into this business, but I'll just share them with you, and you take them however you will. When someone arrives to the scene, law enforcement personnel, and they come in the building, and they see a teacher or a person with a gun, and there is an active killing event happening, the chances of them putting you down, waving that gun, are very high. Even if you have that pre-registered while they're arriving, because the situation is happening so fast that they won't be able to differentiate you between a shooter. Now, you could be screaming, I am not the shooter, I'm a teacher, and that might save your life. But in that situation, it becomes very important to understand that you're taking that risk on. Also, the way law enforcement are drilled to operate weapons is to a high proficiency level, meaning they are drilled firing thousands of rounds a year in high-pressured situations, not just at a firing range. So their belief is, look, educators got in to educate. If they are out drilling in the same way that we are, then it's a conversation that we can have. If they're out firing thousands of rounds in high-pressured situations, then that might produce a better result. But what happens if that teacher, by accident, shoots a student while trying to shoot the perpetrator or the suspect? Who's liable now? Is the school liable? Is the teacher liable? They killed someone. No, was they protecting? Those laws have not been talked about enough yet to provide a school district, I think, real sound ways to start integrating the weapons use. But do I think it's a viable option? Yes. For some school districts, I think it's even better if it's has to be controlled and has to be trained and drilled properly. But like I said, I'm neither for nor against, but for some school districts, I think it's a great option.
Thank you, Mason. Another question from one of our listeners or viewers: what can school safety officers do to step up skills specifically around school safety?
So if you're talking about a school safety officer, that could go one or two ways. That could be a teacher that's within the school, an educator who's gone through a school safety academy. Or That could be another term for a school resource officer. So if we look at it from the educator perspective, what can be done is literally drive up to your sheriff's department, drive up to your police department, and say, do you have a deputy, or do you have some time I can schedule with a deputy to fully understand one of these situations? And they will, free of charge. You can even request that they come to your school and do a free risk mitigation workshop for all the educators. That is a very important first step. And there are literally, I know, in the Midwest, the Northeast, California, and there's quite a few other parts of the state, work with school safety groups and specialists to certify different teachers in these understanding of how to deal with the situation. So if you can get to training, if you can get law enforcement to come to your school, those are great ways to boost your knowledge and understanding.
Another question, with your identified countermeasures, how do you support this with it being in direct violation of the building and fire codes prohibiting any security device or system that emits a medium that obscures a means of egress?
So if we take the door egress, for example, meaning it has to egress from the inside, and you take, let's take the example of a fire killing someone inside of a school. When was the last time that happened? It was over 60 years ago. Well, we face a new threat emergency in America, much different than fire, but that can incorporate fire, and that is the active killer. So if law enforcement are still able to track that suspect, they still know where the suspect is, then they can tell a classroom, they can communicate directly to a classroom that these are the evacuation practices we're going to do, or they can even send law enforcement to personally evacuate. These new standards of safety change law enforcement's tactics for how to deal with the situation and causes so much empowerment to them that the whole thought of what goes against fire code or safety code is going to completely change over the next 24 to 36 months to where it is now more important to guard against an active killer threat or a violent crime in our school than it is to think about a slight obscuration of students, because now you know where the students are and now you know where the bad guy is. So it's a very good question, and it's one that will be debated quite a bit, but it's also something that gets into the realm of the threat has changed from fire to a killer.
I've got another great question here. What are the hurdles that states face for addressing and or creating new safety standards within their state?
The biggest hurdle that a state faces is right now the communities don't know what's out there, and they don't know the reality of one of these events. They don't know how fast it happens. They don't know how many people are shot and wounded. And like we just heard, the one happening in the community college in Oregon, we'll be diving into that to dissect and figure out what happened there. But where it really starts is the major hurdle is just getting the first law enforcement group to say with you as the community, we do deserve this. Right now, a lot of law enforcement don't know that these technologies are out there. Indiana's doing it differently because the Homeland Security is behind this for the state, Sheriff's Association, Chiefs of Police Association, SWAT Officers Association, all these groups. But it started because one law enforcement group said, you know what, we do need to do better. Now the template's been designed, so take this information to your Sheriff's Association in your state and have them stronghold it there and get it moving as well.
Mason, does Indiana share their action plan for other states to review?
Yes. Right now, if you go to ourkidsdeserveit.org, you'll get more information as to who the players are. Now, when you understand who's pushing this agenda of really just making our schools safer, you'll be able to get more information from them. So if it's coming from the Sheriff's Association, if it's coming from the General Assembly, if you want more information on the bill, if you want a full action review of step 1 through 100 to how this happened, that can all be provided as well.
Wonderful. Another question, what do you feel can be done on the front side as far as more effective threat assessment to interrupt an active shooter from the fantasy phase when they're thinking about it to the actual event?
This is part of why Our Kids Deserve It was created, because it gets back to the training, okay? And not necessarily the training for the school, but the training for teachers to understand what risk mitigation is. And that goes into understanding another topic that would take another hour for us to talk about, which is bullying and cyberbullying and these different things that happen. But it really is being a little more vigilant from our educators, and it's asking them to go even a step further than what they are, even though they're completely maxed out with time, and saying more relationships need to be built, deeper relationships need to be built. And in no way am I saying that to say that teachers are not doing that, but the first way to mitigate this is the teacher knowing the student's name, knowing the students in the hallway's name, knowing their family, and being able to ask them as a friend at times, are you okay? You can talk to me about anything. And a lot of times in those instances, if you create that bond that will supersede someone's intent or emotions to be unstable later on.
I had another interesting question come in here in terms of notifying LEOs. How do you deal with schools that don't allow students to have cell phone in class? Isn't a lot of the 911 calls coming out of the students' cell phones?
That's a very good question. There's two pieces to that. One is, not only are there school systems that don't allow students to have phones in school, but there's a lot of schools that don't even have reception at the school, either due to the steel structure base of the school or due to the concrete structure of the school. What needs to happen is, and this is the easiest way to solve that problem, is you bring in your local law enforcement groups to sit down with your teachers, bring in your sheriff, bring in your chief of police, bring in your deputies, bring in your SWAT guys, bring in your judge, whoever wants to come in that's part of public safety, bring in your fire guys, bring in your EMS, and just have a real debate with the superintendent and the principal and say, hey, the question here is the validity of a student having their cell phone. Now, from a teacher's perspective, I've been a teacher, it gets very nerve-wracking seeing somebody text, seeing somebody play a game, so on and so forth, but if it is part of the safety plan that gets agreed upon by your local law enforcement professionals and your school professionals, that a student should have their phone, or that 2 or 3 room shepherd students should have a phone, well then you guys can talk about that and come up with a real answer that fits your school system in particular.
We have time for one more question. Should the nation look into using a standard response plan like ALICE?
So, part of the training, and I glossed over it a little bit, is not only training your teachers and your students in your classroom, but bringing in a group like your ALICE, like your I Love You guys, like your state police who will provide free trainings, and learning what they have to teach. Because once you've learned, you can now integrate that information into your school safety plan. So a group like ALICE does amazing work. They do a run, fight, hide pattern that tells you to do different things at different times. And what's so amazing about any group coming in is that it gets the dialogue going so that you can figure out the best way for your school to incorporate that information. So as a nation, every school should be trained in a certain way. But if we are doing that, all that training needs to come through some kind of national certification process so we know what's being trained specifically to meet certain school safety standards.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mason. This has been quite enlightening. I'm really amazed, actually, at new options, new best practices coming out. Keep up the good work.
Sure.
We really want to see some of these best practices implemented. And for those of you that are still listening, the website, ourkidsdeserveit.org, will have updates on what's happening here in Indiana, which is a leading state in the nation right now with one of the safest schools in the country that was put together here. These packages of these capabilities were added to that school here. For those of you, as you leave, you're going to see a survey pop up. Please let us know how you felt about this webinar. Let us know if this was good information for you. You can also download the additional information, the white paper that is sort of the basis for this webinar, at the address that you can see on your screen there, http://info.envisagenow.com/school safety today, and that will give you access to the white paper as well. Please fill out the survey. Do tell us what other topics you would like to see in the future in our Public Safety Innovator Series of webinars. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you, Mason, for an incredible presentation.
Thank you.